G7 issues condemnation of China as it intensifies response to Beijing. The West to supply F-16s to Ukraine as Russia warns colossal risks. Zelenskyy campaigning peace plan at Arab and G7 summit. Chief says it's time to reform Security Council. ICC undeterred by Russian arrest warrant for chief prosecutor. Warring factions agree 7-day ceasefire in Sudan. El Salvador stadium crush leaves at least 500 wounded. Wagner mercenary group to leave Bakhmut this week.
Hello, I'm Amber. Thank you for joining us on Funday News. It is Monday, May 22nd, and here are your top stories. The G7 issued its strongest condemnation yet of China last Saturday, criticizing the country's economic coercion and urged a peaceful solution to tensions across the Taiwan Strait. In a joint statement, the G7 countries said they were concerned about China's actions in the South China Sea and that they strongly oppose any unilateral attempts to change the status quo by force or coercion. The joint statement drew a quick reaction from Beijing as its foreign ministry said that the G7 had attacked it.
G7 leaders said, "The world has encountered a disturbing rise in incidents of economic coercion that seek to exploit economic vulnerabilities and dependencies and undermine the foreign and domestic policies and positions of G7 members as well as partners around the world. We will therefore deepen our strategic dialogue to seek to counter malicious practices. To protect global value and supply chains from illegitimate influence, espionage, illicit knowledge leakage, and sabotage."
U.S. President Joe Biden told G7 leaders last Friday that Washington supports joint allied training programs for Ukrainian pilots on F-16 fighter jets. Russia's state media TASS news agency quoted Russian Deputy Foreign Minister Alexander Grushko as saying on Saturday, Western countries will run colossal risks if they supply Ukraine with F-16 fighter jets. Grushko was quoted as saying, "We see that Western countries are still adhering to the escalation scenario. It involves colossal risks for themselves."
Senior U.S. officials said last Friday U.S. officials have estimated the most expeditious time needed for training and delivery of F-16s at 18 months. Training on the U.S.-made jets will take place in Europe. Although the U.S. official did not say which countries would participate, British Prime Minister Rishi Sunak said the UK would work with the Netherlands, Belgium and Denmark to get Ukraine the combat air capability it needs. U.S. officials said they hope to begin training in the coming weeks.
Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy addressed a summit of Arab leaders in Saudi Arabia last Friday before he arrived in Hiroshima, Japan on Saturday, who is seeking wider support for a 10-point peace plan that demands that Russian forces retreat from Ukraine. In Jeddah, Zelenskyy urged leaders at the Arab summit to resist Moscow's influence and consider his peace proposals. He said Crimea was the first to suffer from the Russian occupation, and most of those who suffer repression in occupied Crimea are Muslims.
Every such warrior is on the path of justice.
On Sunday, Zelenskyy met with Joe Biden for a bilateral meeting in Japan amid speculation that Washington would agree on providing F-16 to Ukraine. With the G7 repeating its unswerving backing for Kyiv in its final communiqué, Zelenskyy also has tried to persuade the leaders of key non-aligned countries, including India and Brazil, to follow G7's move. Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi told Zelenskyy, "I can assure you that to resolve this India and, me personally, we'll do whatever we can do."
UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres said on Sunday that it was time to reform both the Security Council and Bretton Woods to align with the realities of today's world. Speaking at a press conference at the G7 summit in Hiroshima, Japan, Guterres said, "The global financial architecture became outdated, dysfunctional, and unfair in the face of the economic shocks from the COVID-19 pandemic and the Russian invasion of Ukraine. It has failed to fulfill its core function as a global safety net."
Despite calls for a ceasefire from inside and outside the country.
Guterres said the institution reflected the power relations of 1945 and needed to be updated. He said there was a growing consciousness among developing countries that not enough was being done to reform outdated institutions or remove the frustrations of the Global South. G7 host Japan made a point of inviting figures from the so-called Global South to Hiroshima for talks. Invitees included Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi, Brazil's President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva, and Indonesian President Joko Widodo.
I always needed time on my own. I never thought I could be here.
I take your blessings with your heartaches too. It's so easy and so wonderful to know it's you.
学习，一切从今天开始。Funday 英语。
Russia's state-owned news agency TASS reported last Friday Russia has issued an arrest warrant for the International Criminal Court prosecutor, who in March prepared a warrant for President Vladimir Putin on war crimes charges. The member states of ICC on Saturday said they are deeply concerned by Russia's decision to place a court prosecutor and several judges on a wanted list. TASS said the ICC's British prosecutor Karim Khan has been added to the Russian Interior Ministry's wanted list.
The presidency of the Assembly of States Parties to the ICC, the court's management oversight body, said in a statement it regrets these acts of intimidation and unacceptable attempts to undermine the mandate of the International Criminal Court to investigate, sanction and prevent the commission of the gravest international crimes. The Hague-based ICC issued a warrant for President Vladimir Putin in March, accusing him of the war crime of illegally deporting children from Ukraine.
A temporary ceasefire in Sudan has been agreed as fighting between two warring factions entered its sixth week. Previous truce attempts between Sudan's regular army and the paramilitary Rapid Support Forces (RSF) have tended to collapse within minutes of beginning. But according to a U.S. Saudi statement, the new deal will be enforced by a ceasefire monitoring mechanism. As part of the 7-day humanitarian ceasefire, Sudanese officials have agreed to restore essential services.
Fighting between the two sides in Sudan has plunged the country into chaos since it began last month, with more than 1 million people thought to have been displaced. Both the regular army and the RSF have been urged to allow the distribution of humanitarian aid, restore essential services and withdraw forces from hospitals. The United States and Saudi Arabia, who sponsored the peace talks in Jeddah, said the ceasefire would come into effect on Monday evening.
Officials have said at least 12 people have died after a crush at a football stadium in El Salvador's capital, San Salvador. The disaster reportedly occurred after a large number of fans tried to enter the venue after the gates had been closed. A volunteer with the Rescue Commandos First Aid Group told journalists it was an avalanche of fans who overran the gate. Some were still under the metal in the tunnel. Others managed to make it to the stands and then to the field and were smothered.
El Salvador President Nayib Bukele described the event as unprecedented and said an exhaustive investigation would be launched. The incident occurred during a match between local team Alianza and the Santa Ana-based team FAS at Cuscatlan Stadium. The match was subsequently suspended. The Salvadoran Soccer Federation said that all national-level football matches on Sunday would be suspended. The Civil Protection of El Salvador said that about 500 people had been given medical treatment.
The head of Russia's Wagner mercenary group said on Sunday that his forces had captured all the territory in the eastern Ukrainian city of Bakhmut as promised and would leave the conflict zone later this week. Yevgeny Prigozhin said in an audio message posted on Telegram messaging app, "We have captured all the territory we promised to capture, as we stated yesterday. We are handing over our positions to Russia's Defense Ministry, and on the 25th of May, we are leaving the conflict zone."
Prigozhin said on Saturday that his forces had taken control of Bakhmut, under attack by Russian forces for more than 9 months. But Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy and military chiefs denied this on Sunday. Ukraine said on Sunday that its forces were still advancing around the edges of Bakhmut, aiming to encircle the ruined eastern city after Moscow congratulated the Wagner private army and Russian troops for capturing it.
Now let's take a look at the vocabulary of the news of G7 issuing condemnation of China. Number 1, condemnation, 谴责,指责. Condemn, 谴责. There was widespread condemnation of the invasion. 那次侵略遭到了人们普遍的指责。Number 2, coercion, 强迫、胁迫. Coerce, 强迫、胁迫. He claimed he had only acted under coercion. 他声称他只是受了胁迫才采取了行动。Number 3, unilateral, 单方的. They were forced to take unilateral action. 他们被迫采取单方面行动。And that's all for today's Funday News. Be sure to tune into Funday News from Monday to Friday and click the link below to join Funday for free. I'm Amber, your host, and I'll see you next time.